Chancellor, graduands, guests, I now have the further honour to invite Professor John Edward Norwood Charlie Veron to give today's occasional address.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. One and all, especially you young guys. I'm just going to read a little bit about my memoir, which was about when I first came to this university, if I can find it. Leaving Sydney in February 1963 felt like being released from prison. Good, but not all good. For I might have worn the label damaged goods. I knew virtually no physics and no chemistry. I was unsure how a slide rule worked. I guess some of you wouldn't be too good at that either. Anyhow, I hadn't got a clue what calculus meant, and was doubtful about the difference between a cosine and a street sign. My spelling was atrocious, my grammar worse, and on top of that, I could not play any sort of sport, and worse still, I was withdrawn and lacking in most teenage social skills. So, how come this down and out is up here in this coat of many colours today? Well, I dashed off to my analyst to find out, and she said, "Daddy, you're going there because you're just so full of bullshit." I consulted further with my family, and he must be on some sort of Asperger's or some syndrome. "Daddy, you got to be kidding. He's not on any sort of syndrome. Or maybe he's very bright." Hang on. It's your father we're talking about. You're not bright. So, how do you find out who you are? It does matter. Just think, if you know who you are, you can make smart choices about your career, your partner, where you want to live, what's for lunch, all that sort of thing. And I know Aristotle, using my words, put that at the top of his list about must-haves. Well, I had a bit of a helping hand from the psych department here, because when I got a scholarship to do anything I wanted, I had to be interviewed by the psych department, and I was for all 9 years when I was here. So what do they find out? I don't think they found out anything, but they did ask me a lot about my childhood, and that I can relate to, because I was a horrible little kid. I was in a bubble, and in that bubble was my big dog and nature. And I love nature, loving in the bush. And I became a real expert about nature and what was in the bush. And I switched off most other things at the same time. A real pain in the ass. I went to primary school, and I loved it. My teacher, which is probably the only teacher in my life who actually liked me, nicknamed me Charles Darwin. I was always Charles Darwin this. Will you pay attention? Anyhow, the school used to have show and tells, which were girls used to bring dolls and dresses and stuff like that, silly stuff. I bought really good stuff, which was dragonflies or praying mantises stuck to bits of cardboard. And when I went to show that to the kids, they just backed off. And I thought, gee, this is fun. So one day I brought out the heavy gun, the seriously heavy gun, in a jar, and that jar had a very, very big, black, hairy, aggressive funnel web spider. And the class exploded, the teacher exploded, and I got into lots of trouble, and the kids started calling me Charlie, Charlie, and that's why I'm called Charlie today. Well, all that lovely life came to a swift end when I went to Barker College, a private school in Sydney. And I do hasten to add, that school is nothing like today what it was then. Then bullying was encouraged. It turned boys into men. And the boys had to do what they were told, when they were told, and they had to learn what they had to learn. They had to follow a strict curriculum, and I couldn't. I just tried and I couldn't. And then, oh dear, I had developed asthma in Sydney, and that asthma got worse and worse until I couldn't play any sport. In fact, it got so bad it was life-threatening. And then, to make matters all the more worse, I started to stutter. And the stutter got so bad that I could hardly say anything. So this poor kid couldn't play any sport, couldn't barely talk, and the bottom of the class. I just wanted to escape Sydney. I wanted to go to Hawkesbury Agricultural College, and that meant getting a Commonwealth Scholarship. So I tried really hard, and the final public exams, the Leaving Certificate, I got the worst result of any kid in my whole year. I repeated the year, thanks to my parents, who actually had come to believe that I was who the school said I was. I was two people. I was me, that was someone I thought was real, and then there was what the school made, and that was a completely different person. And everybody believed what the school made of me was that person, even my mother. Anyhow, I didn't do any better the second time at the Leaving Certificate, but that is when I was dragged along to some psychologists doing it was a big public exam, and then another big, smaller public exam, and then an interview where I was told, yes, they had 10 kids who could do anything they want at any Australian university. And when they told me that, I said, you've just made a mistake. I'm nothing like that. And what am I supposed to be good at? And they said, cognitive reasoning. You got the highest score in the state. I said, what's that? People like you are very good at mathematics. I never passed a maths exam in my life. And that's, anyhow, the state I was in when I came to this university. And then big things happened. No, I wasn't a budding Elon Musk. I'm sorry, I just wasn't. But when I came here, my asthma vanished. And I've been working on my stutter, and the stutter vanished too. I became active, physically active. I could run a long ways, to run miles and miles and miles, and then go to Lake Sot, leap over where it says no swimming, dive in and cool off and get back to my college. And I became a different person, and I became, again, but I was missing the sea. Now, when I was a little kid, I kept an aquarium amongst a lot of other stuff. I had a garage, which my father let me have. I kept all sorts of stuff in it. And one of those, in the garage, there was an aquarium. And I caught a little octopus down at Long Reef, cleaned out the aquarium, and I kept him. And people now believe it if they've seen the film My Octopus Teacher. But that little octopus came when he was called. When I called him, he'd climb up the side of the aquarium, up my arm, take a little bit of prawn meat, and then go back to a little cave I made him. And he was a very polite little octopus because he flashed little blue rings at me. Okay, we've got some marine biologists here. This southern blue-ringed octopus is one of the most deadly animals in the ocean. And that was not known then. That was headlines many, many years later. Well, Barker College was, to me, just the pits. It was the end. It was something I had tried to keep a notion of who I was. But when I came to this university, all things changed. When I started running, when I dived into Lake Sot, another thing that I heard on that first week was some classical music. It was a Bach Brandenburg concerto, and I loved it. And I became obsessed with classical music, just as I used to be obsessed by nature. Well, that came in very handy during lectures, because I could sit there, look intently at the lecturer, and play a bit of Bach or Beethoven in my head. And after the lecture, I might ask another, what was all that about? I had no notion of what these lectures are about, and I didn't do well at all, but I didn't fail anything. Well, I also met my first love in life, my first girlfriend, later become my wife. I was terrified of women. I went to a boys' school, boys' college, and across the side of the corridor was an ace football player. He said, "Charlie, you've got to go and play football." And so I joined the Epsilon Dregs, which was the lowliest football team in the whole university. And of course, it was the one to play. I could hardly believe it. A girls' team. I think it was Mary White. And it was the most savage experience I've had in my whole life. I never played football again. I used to escape down to the coast. The university had a marine station, Arrawarra, and I used to go swimming off the headland. And then I found someone who had a scuba tank. Now, I'd never met a scuba diver before, and he lent me his tank. He said, try not to drown yourself. And so we started then, a scuba club unknown to the university. And that took a leap forward when, a little bit late at night, the zoology department really didn't miss their 14-foot runabout. We would hitch it up to a car, and down the coast we would go, and out to the Solitary Islands. And there I found acres and acres and acres of corals. And they're on display now at this really lovely museum, which I saw yesterday, just over there, the corals that we found at the Solitary Islands. I wanted to make the whole place a marine park. Not even the Great Barrier Reef was a marine park in those days, and it is now a marine park. So I had an interest in corals. But Kirsty, by then my wife, was thumbing through the Armidale, I think we call it the Armidale Distress, but that may not be the right name for it, the Armidale newspaper, and there was an advertisement in it for expressions of interest in doing a PhD on, getting a postdoc to work on the Great Barrier Reef. You had to be a scuba diver. And I thought, I had been to a conference, the only conference at that time, and I got offered 4 postdocs on the spot because my PhD was on dragonflies. And dragonflies go to this extraordinary bit of behavior at dawn in the morning, and they change color. And that's what my PhD was about, except I couldn't submit it for 1.5 years because the university wouldn't let me. But anyhow, I kept on playing with these dragonflies. It was a lovely project. I was going off to Canada on one of these postdocs, but then the Great Barrier Reef called. Why would I go to Canada when I can go to this beautiful place? And I did. So off to Townsville we went. The head of zoology saying he never wanted to speak to me again. I ditched my career for a diving holiday. Now that was not the only down point in this whole thing. When the first job I had was at this university as a research fellow. Not a research fellow, a research assistant to Hal Heatwell, who's here now. And that involved, amongst many other things, collecting snakes. Now, I wasn't frightened of snakes, not like most people are, and so we collected all the nasties, the tiger snakes, black snakes, death adders, copperheads, you name them, and we kept them in the snake house, which was on the parapet, which still exists, although I think it's due to be demolished, between zoology and botany. And I looked after the snakes in this snake house. But I was going on a fortnight's trip, and I asked a technician in zoology to make sure the lights were on. It was really important to keep these snakes warm. I popped some mice for their dinner into these enclosures, and off I went. I came back, and I was a bit worried about these snakes. It was getting on late at night, and it was all in darkness. And I opened the first door, and there was a dead mouse, and it stank, and the snake didn't move, and the next door, and the next door. And then I got more and more alarmed until I got to the end where there's a big enclosure that had my 16-foot amethystine python. She was an absolute darling of a snake. And I was so pleased when I saw her move. I was really worried. And then horror upon horror, she was moving because the rat I had put in her cage for her to eat had eaten a hole in her body and was eating her from the inside. I burst into tears. I was so upset. I went home and the night wore on, and come round about dawn, something worried me. And then I realized I hadn't shut any of these enclosure doors. Oh dear. So I thought today is going to be my last day at the University of New England. I had let a whole heap of venomous snakes loose down in zoology, right in the middle of the university. And sure enough, when I turned up, all very nervous and ready to run, the head of the department, Professor O'Farrell, very large man, came waddling over to me. He said, "Charlie, some louts have broken into the snake house and let the whole lot go." And builders have walked off. The Department of Botany has shut their doors. The zoologists, you see them out here. Can you catch them? I said, yeah, I can catch them. And I did. And he was so pleased with me that he offered me a job of teaching fellow on the spot. That's how I became a teaching fellow, and I loved it. The zoology department was a little bit on the decadent side. As a teaching fellow, I was asked, could I do this course, take that course, and I eventually wound up teaching all the courses of the entire zoology department, including to external students, which I loved. Well, that was my life at this university, and it was so full of just about everything I could ever dream about. But then I headed up to Townsville with my family, and there to take up a postdoc on corals, the taxonomy of corals. I knew nothing about corals. I had never, and still have never, been to a lecture on marine biology in my life. The university library had anticipated work on corals, and I don't know where they got them from. They had huge numbers of these horrible monographs about coral taxonomy, some in German Gothic, some in Latin, French. I don't know any of this stuff, and I found them all absolutely unreadable. Well, on top of that, but I got on well with the Vice-Chancellor, and I was astonished, but he let me have the university's brand new research vessel take on its first cruise, and that became the first expedition to the far northern Great Barrier Reef, and that had all sorts of super good things coming out of it, not only about corals, not only about reefs, but, as I worked out, Aboriginal people who, nobody would believe me, actually lived under the reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. When I came up with that, one of the local newspapers up there, the local newspaper up there, what do they say? I haven't got it. They had a cartoon of me diving down with my scuba tank to a group of Aboriginal people around a fire under a coral reef. And the director of AIMS was apoplectic with rage and sacked me on the spot. And that was the second time I've actually been, 4 times I have been sacked, and 4 times the council have come to my rescue. 4 times I got promoted, and so I've not only never applied for a job, I have never applied for a promotion. Now, in all this, I'm wondering, what's in it for you guys? We've already established that I'm not Elon Musk. We've already established that good fortune might have come my way. Have I just been lucky? I don't think so. The other side of that coin I haven't talked to you about, but I think it's probably breaking even, luck or no luck. Psycho stuff. Am I on some syndrome or another, some spectrum or another? Am I really? I don't think so. The psych department found out nothing about me of interest, and I knew nothing about me of interest, except for one thing. There is an uncanny resemblance between Darwin's career and mine, and not only career, but who they are and what they did and why they did it. And that's a bit like the priest saying, I'm just like the Pope. So, but forgive me for bringing that out, but I'm going to speak now about the 5 points that I think mattered in my career, because I think they're likely to matter very much in your career. And I'm not only going to speak for myself, I'm also going to speak for Darwin and a whole lot of other people that I know. So these 5 points are as follows. 1, follow your own nose. Just do it no matter what, not what other people say, your own nose. I started doing that when I was 13, and horror upon horror, I announced I didn't believe God existed. And that really had some serious consequences for me, threatened expulsion from my school to start with. 2, persistence. I hope you are all as stubborn as hell. Be stubborn, just stick to it, and don't not stick to it. It's all the same old stuff about falling off a horse and getting back on again. Fall off a horse 12 times, but eventually stick to that horse, be stubborn, follow your own nose, and don't be persuaded to do otherwise. 3, just do it. Now, that's an important one, because if you have an idea, a chance, or whatever, what I'm saying is, just bloody well do it. Don't be reasonable. Don't say, oh, this or maybe that. If it's not too dangerous, if it's not too catastrophic, do it. Because of all the things you'll just do, some are not good ideas at all, okay? But most of them will have some merit as a good idea, and so I'm saying just do it. Number 4, think. Okay. I think most scientists bloody well don't think. It's not about thinking about what's in front of you. It's about thinking of the bigger picture around what you've got in front of you, and maybe the bigger picture beyond that. If you've got that big picture worked out, then you can focus on the stuff ahead, and you can focus in a real way that's going to make a real difference. It is so important to think. So I have made a lot of discoveries. You can Google it all if you can be bothered. But most of them have been made in bed in the morning because I've thought about it. And finally, I'm going to sound like an old fishwife or maybe a mother-in-law, but kindness and generosity are absolutely at the core of my life and that of so many others. Be kind and be generous. And I'm not talking about just doing nice things. And I'm talking about being kind automatically. Don't think about it. You're an automatically kind person, and you're kind even to the people you don't like, except Vladimir Putin, of course. And kindness and generosity is been the key to the lives of so many of my colleagues. Guys, you're facing a hell of a future with artificial intelligence about to descend on you, and climate change, which is slowly starting to ramp up. But you are in such a privileged spot. You really are. You're in the best country on the planet for a future. And look at you. You've got a degree. You've got a flying start. And so your future is very much in your hands. And so before I'm told to get off this stage, I'm just going to say that I wish you all individually prosperous and a happy and fulfilling life. And thank you for listening to me.